Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 150, Jews of No Religion. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And we're back for the last episode of 2018, the final episode in our series launching off from the 2013 Pew Report. Before we jump into our conversation, I wanted to just make two requests of our listeners here on the last Friday of the year. Number one is our final request of the year and perhaps ever to complete our listener survey. It's an opportunity for you to weigh in on what we should be doing next. Like we talk about for everybody, we think that it's really important to be out there and be responsive to the actual needs of Jews out there. And we're asking you what your needs are that are not being met by us and that are not being met by anyone so that we can determine whether maybe that's something that we could get involved with. So it's not your typical listener survey. We're not asking you your favorite episode or anything like that. But if you want to let us know that, you can send us an email. But we are asking you to let us know what your unmet Jewish needs are. And so if you want to fill in that survey, which we'd be extremely grateful for, and we'll reward you with a special preview of what's going to be coming up on Judaism Unbound in 2019, you can go to www.judaismunbound.com/survey and fill that in. The second thing we'd like to ask you on this last Friday of 2018 is if you might consider an end-of-year philanthropic gift to support Judaism Unbound. If you've been enjoying Judaism Unbound all year or for the last 3 years, this might be a great time to help us keep it going by making a small or a large donation. We often suggest something like $1 for every episode that you listen to. So if you listen every week, perhaps around $50. If you listen occasionally, perhaps $18. But if you really want to make a statement at the end of the year that says, hey, we really believe in this. We really think this is something important for the Jewish community. We accept gifts of any size. You can make monthly recurring donations. You can make one-time donations. And all of that can be done at www.judaismunbound.com/donate. And we're so grateful for all the support that you might be able to give and for anything that you're able to give to support this work. So now let's jump into our conversation. I actually think that somewhat unintentionally, our last interview is a really great jumping off point where Daniel Boyarin was talking about the word Judaism and the idea of Judaism as a religion as a modern notion, something that really doesn't have ancient roots. The idea of Judaism as a religion, according to Boyarin, was something that was introduced by the early Christians that the Jews rejected for hundreds and hundreds and over 1,000 years until in modernity, Jews in various European countries adopted the idea of Judaism as a religion in order to feel that they could be accepted as members of that nation. So he explained that while it would seem strange to say, I'm a German Frenchman, it's not nearly as strange to say, I'm a French Jew. But that had the result of Judaism slowly but surely being perceived, even by many Jews, as just a religion. And what's really interesting in the way that this connects to the Pew study is it seems that that modern notion that's been around for perhaps a couple of hundred years seems to be being rejected by many Jews on their own, not even necessarily because they have an extremely sophisticated understanding of what Judaism is, or they have a lot of Jewish education and they understand that Judaism isn't a religion, but they're actually just gravitating towards this idea on their own that they're Jews, but that for them, Judaism is not functioning as a religion. And while we might, and I think many of the readers of the Pew study have understood this to be some postmodern phenomenon where now we have to contend with some kind of Judaism that's not a religion, actually, in some ways, it's actually the most ancient phenomenon, which I think was really fascinating.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. And it's a mixture of things. It's like on some level intuitive, right? Like I think that part of what's so refreshing for me when I read Daniel Bayarin is I just am nodding my head a lot. And it's just like, yeah, like the way he spoke about how really elegantly how, okay, so there's certain Christian categories that we tend to place at the center of religion conversations, belief, et cetera. And like in very straightforward ways, when you start to break it down, they don't parallel perfectly. He mentioned the example of somebody who's born to Jewish parents saying, I'm no longer a Jew or I'm not a Jew is a radical statement and a real departure from what their parents were doing in a way that, like, saying I'm not a Christian, it's a statement about a certain belief that you don't hold in Jesus for many people. So it's not parallel. And that was one example of many. And so on some level, I was just like, yeah, okay, so this is an incredible, deeply important book. But like, okay, so we now understand something we've known for a while, which is that this whole religion word doesn't quite map perfectly. Great. Especially great in the context of the Pew study that we've been at some points explicitly looking at and at other points sort of implicitly allowing to wash over our conversation informally. It's especially interesting, fascinating, or intuitive, given that we just had all these people call themselves Jews of no religion, or maybe not like be called by the survey Jews of no religion based on how they respond to questions like, are you Jewish? Yes. Is your religion Judaism? No. That's interesting, and it relates to some very ancient questions. Too often we try to like create this wall, this fourth wall between where we are today and where the past lives. But actually, it's not that dynamics are identical, but similar questions of like, what is a Jew? Who is a Jew? Loom for us as loomed for people a long time ago.
Yeah, I think it's really important to flesh out this idea of Judaism as not a religion and to explain a little bit what I think we mean by that, which is not to deny that there isn't religion as an important part of being a Jew for much and perhaps all of Jewish history until very recently. It's just that there's a real difference in understanding religion to be one of 10 dimensions of what it means to be a Jew rather than the definition itself. And I think that for me, the confusion or the area that I'm trying to figure out how to talk about in language is to say, if Judaism is a religion and you don't believe in it or you don't believe in God or in the various aspects of religion, then it's like you're barely a Jew. But if Judaism, or maybe you're not a Jew at all, like Christians often say, if I don't believe in Jesus anymore, I'm not a Christian, I'm a person of Christian origins or whatever. And I think, by the way, I hear a lot of Jews saying I'm a person of Jewish origin, and I don't think that many of them, some of them are saying I actually don't want to be part of this group at all. But a lot of them are saying, I just don't believe. I don't believe in Judaism, and so how can I really call myself a Jew? But I think that in thinking that way, they're actually absorbing a way of thinking that actually comes from Christianity, and that Jews typically and traditionally have not thought that way. And so I actually think there's a lot of trouble that comes along with this notion that we've absorbed of Judaism being a religion. That is the definition of Judaism. And then the question is like, okay, well, if you go back to this idea that Judaism is a lot of different things, and religion is one of the traditional constitutive parts of it, then you can say, well, I don't particularly connect with that part of it, just as you could easily say that, and nobody would have much of a problem with it if you said, oh, well, I don't really like to eat traditional Jewish foods. Okay, fine. So you can do the other 9 things. So I do think that this then connects with conversations that we were having with Tobin Belzer and Robert Mnookin and others about, so what is Jewish identity? What does it mean to be a Jew? And let's assume for the sake of the conversation that we accept the definition of Judaism or Jewishness as potentially including religious behavior and religious practices, but not solely constituted by those. And then you say, okay, well, so then going forward, what does it mean to be a Jew?
Yes. What does it mean to be a Jew in one podcast episode? This is going to be fun. So Yeah, I mean, I've been enjoying wrestling with guests about this too. And for me, I want to break down a few words that we use a lot of times in Jewish communal conversations, in individual, just small talk conversations with other folks. Jewish identity is one term. Judaism is another term that we've already unpacked a little bit. Jewishness. I mean, we could go down the list of all these different descriptions or abstractions that we apply to like broad notions of what is Jewish or who are Jews. Jewish identity is a big one for both our conversation with Robert Mnookin and, of course, our conversation with Tobin Belzer. I want to clarify that, like, the question, who do we identify as Jews, or what do Jews identify as Jewish, is actually not quite, in my opinion, the same question as, like, how do we relate to Jewish identity? Because I think what Tobin Belzer really lays out beautifully is that, like, in quotes, Jewish identity has become this trait or possession that Jews have. Like, I have a Jewish identity. It's actually, like, when you back out for a second, that's like a weird thing to say. But a lot of us, I say it plenty of times. Like, yeah, I have a strong Jewish identity. Like what does that mean? Like, and what she beautifully lays out the history of is that, like, it's not an accident that we talk that way. Jewish social science very much, and the whole idea of Jewish identity that comes from the social science of Jewry, treated as sort of a given that Jewish identity writ large is sort of in peril. So it's important for individual Jews to have this thing called Jewish identity, because if people don't have, like, picture all these words in quotes, by the way. If people don't have Jewish identities, the lack of one could be equated with assimilation or with no more Judaism. And especially in the 20th century, where thinking about everything from pogroms in Russia to the Holocaust to all sorts of forms of oppression of Jews, like, that's a memory that really is important. And so Jewish identity, the entire framework, arises from there. And so we have this thing that can be weak or strong. And we say that, like, lighting Shabbat candles will strengthen Jewish identity. Going to a summer camp will strengthen Jewish identity. X, Y, or Z Jewish project will or will not strengthen Jewish identity. This choice that people could make will weaken Jewish identity. And we then study what the answers are. And we try to discern, like, what's going to make the strongest, quote, Jewish identity, whatever that means. And what that takes as a given, which I question, is that there are a bunch of things that are Judaism, and that doing those things sort of marks you in that group and helps to perpetuate this notion, this people, this religion, this whatever we're calling it, called Judaism. And what I appreciated from Tobin Belzer is, like, no, Jews have identities, and people have identities, and those identities include relationships with Judaism, with Jewish holidays, with Jewish foods, with Jewish people. Jewish identities, as she identified, also incorporate relationships, not just romantic, but like literal personal relationships with those who aren't Jewish. All of those things are wrapped up together. And so it creates a much more sophisticated idea of what it means to sort of participate in a Jewish communal endeavor of any kind, because it suggests our goal isn't to, like, save or preserve or conserve or even improve or cause to thrive Jewish identity. Our endeavor is to, like, do things that will be powerful and good and speak to Jews.
Yeah, well, now I'd like to go through the history of the transcripts of the podcast to see if I've ever used the term Jewish identity other than quoting someone else, because I don't think it's a term that I have any interest in. And I'm wondering if I'm wrong about that, you know, if I actually have talked about it or have. But here's how I'm thinking about it. There's another element of my personal life that's very important to me, which is being a Democrat. And maybe even more than being a Democrat, being a progressive. And I don't feel in any way that I have a Democratic identity or a progressive identity. I don't think that it's just not a concept that has any value to me to think of it as I have a democratic identity. What it is to me is a system of belief about what is the good society and a pattern of behavior that I engage in terms of who I vote for and what protests I attend and what I see as good or not good when I look at the direction of our country or our society. So the idea that it's important to me whether other people have a democratic identity or a progressive identity, it's not important at all. What's important to me is whether this worldview is enacted in the world. And so I don't know if it's just... So then I guess my question is, where does the whole Sturm-und-Drang about Jewish identity come from? Is it because of trauma? Is it because of saying, since people tried to wipe us out, it's really important just that we continue to be, and what it means to continue to be is that people say they are us, and that ultimately equals some kind of notion of Jewish identity? Because if that's what it is, I mean, that's another thing that I have no interest in. It's like, here's a way that I've been thinking a lot about it. I fully expect that my children will probably be Democrats and that they will probably be progressives. But it's not because I've given them a democratic or a progressive identity. It's because hopefully they've grown up in an environment in our home that takes these values really seriously and that talks about them all the time and that hopefully portrays them as both really important and really powerful and good in the way that you think about how to live in the world. And so I hope that I've done a good enough job of living out those values such that my children will probably continue that on. But they're not born as Democrats. They're not born as progressives. And I don't expect them to have any identity of that nature. I think that they're likely to voluntarily associate when they grow up with an association that their parents thought was really important and that hopefully meshed with a value system that they grew up with in their lives. I think that I want Judaism to be experienced just like that for my children. And I guess what I'm also trying to say is that anybody who didn't grow up in my home or in a Jewish home, who also believes that these are good ways to be and wants to be part of it, should also be able to be Jewish, even though they don't have any current Jewish identity, or they certainly didn't grow up with one. So it just feels to me like somehow the whole concept of identity is wrong.
I really appreciate the frame you're bringing up, because what I think you're implying is that Judaism today is more a question of choice than dissent. DES, dissent, not like arguing dissent. And I love that duality, and I want to explore that duality because it came up with multiple of our recent guests. And it gets me thinking to the recent news development around Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And first things first, I'm a huge fan of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I am stoked that she is in Congress. I have actively and excitedly signed all sorts of petitions that she's been on. I think that she's like rocking and rolling. And I think that that's true of a number of other, especially young and female and minority Congress people that we just elected in this country. And I'm really excited about it. That's where I'm coming from. I mean, we don't really hide our politics on this show. I'm not going to hide it today. I come at this from like really genuinely thinking she is bomb.com.
That means really good for our older listeners.
That is terrific. If I ever say bomb.org, that's not a different thing. Okay. But so there were just a number of pieces about how at a gathering of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and like really awesome organization that people should support. It was a candle lighting, and she was participating, and she mentioned as one line of her spiel that people in her family have done a little bit of genealogical research, and she's connected to folks who were likely Jews. I'm thrilled, like you said, at anybody who is excited to connect to Judaism. Anybody who wants to go to an awesome gathering of a Hanukkah lighting devoted to racial justice and give a speech, like rock on, do that. And I hope that when you leave that event, you feel that Judaism, to the extent that thing exists, has moved you in some way. Like I want people who are Jewish, who are not Jewish, who are complicated to experience magic from Judaism. That's part of why I do the work I do. But what's not clear to me is that at any point did she herself suggest I'm Jewish. At a certain point, we all have to do math. If we go back 7 generations, we have 2 to the 7th power ancestors in that generation. That's 128 people. So imagine you go back 10 generations. That's 1,024 people. You really think all 1,024 of those people for any of us are unilaterally one thing? And 8 generations, 10 generations is only that's only a couple hundred years. We need to recognize as human beings that it's not just cliche when we say we're all related or whatever. That is literally true. So we shouldn't be stunned when somebody has a connection to Jewishness or Jewish heritage. My question is, like you said, what importance do we give to that? And on its own, I'm not ready to give it much importance. And it's not, and once again, I want to feel every form of affinity to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that I can. I want to like the same sports team she does. I'd love to shake her hand. Literally, I would love to vibe with her policies and worldview every way. But that doesn't mean I'm going to lazily or dishonestly place an identity on her that she A, hasn't claimed as far as I can tell for herself, and B, that creates this bizarre genetic kind of Judaism that only manifests for people who can trace through 23andMe or whatever that they have it. That's disrespectful to people who convert. That's disrespectful to people who it's just not what I want to be doing.
Well, let me put this in the context of, I think, both history and futurism and float an idea. I actually think that there's an interesting connection to the notion that 200 years ago or so, Judaism became a religion in many Western societies, that Jews accepted the idea that Judaism was a religion for the first time. I wonder if that was kind of a premature recognition of something that is new and that is modern or perhaps postmodern in Judaism, in what Yitz Greenberg has called the third era of Judaism, or we've talked about as Judaism 4.0, which is the idea of Judaism transcending the familial, right? Transcending the genetic. In the modern period, or the postmodern period, what I want to suggest is that Judaism will now become the voluntary association. And then that raises the question, if Judaism is going to become a voluntary association, what are its values that are compelling enough to allow transmission from parent to child in a voluntary manner? What we're feeling, what we're having this sense of, is that going into the future, it doesn't seem like we can make any reasonable restriction on who can become a Jew once we really basically understand that everybody who is a Jew today is a Jew because they chose to be one, not because they were born as one. And to me, it seems like that is the future that we have to look forward to, and that requires us to therefore make being Jewish something worth being.
Are you ready for an all-time terrible lexicon / language play? Because this is gonna rock the socks off of maybe just me. But
I'm very excited.
This is the part of our Dan and Lex episodes where I disagree with you.
Okay.
But that's the spoiler. But I actually don't think that the project is going to be in the future about making being Jewish worthwhile. I think the project is, here it is, make Jewing worth doing. It's not just cutesy. I mean, it is cutesy, but it's not just cutesy. I don't agree that, and I don't think that we're coming from super different places, but I don't agree that the identification process of being Jewish, of becoming, through conversion, through identification, through whatever process, I don't think that is going to be similarly or more important in the future. I actually think that fewer and fewer people will actively make a point in their day-to-day life to call out that they are Jewish. What I'm very convinced of is that people will decide whether or not to do things that are Jewish. And that will be people, that will be a mixture of people who, like, as some form of identity do consider themselves Jewish, and people who don't. The whole question of who is a Jew, who do we count as Jewish, implies that anybody cares what my answer is, or what an organization's answer is, or what a denomination's answer is, or what some abstraction called Judaism thinks of that. Spoiler alert, Judaism doesn't think anything. That's what Daniel Bayoran talked about. People don't care. Like, Christians that are running Passover Seders aren't asking permission. And all over our society, people are doing that which is available. And whether it's because of the internet, whether it's because of all sorts of mechanisms, like, there's a lot available to us. And the idea that lighting of Hanukkah candles will only be meaningful to people who say to themselves, hi, I am a Jew. Like, I am part of a project of Judaism. That is why I light Hanukkah candles. Like, that's ludicrous. It's just factually wrong. Like, we can look at interfaith families. Like, do we really think that in an interfaith family that is lighting Hanukkah candles, the people who don't identify as a Jew, who, if you ask them, are you Jewish? Do we really think that they don't gain meaning from that ritual? Of course they do. Of course they do. And by the way, that goes in the other direction too. Like, do we really think that interfaith families that have Jews and people who aren't Jewish who celebrate a holiday that's not Jewish, if they give Christmas gifts, if they mark Easter in some form, if they mark Diwali in some form, if they whatever it might be, like, do we really think that the Jews aren't also gaining something really valuable and important from that experience? Of course they are. We're not, like, taking up space in rooms when the rooms we're in aren't our self-identified religious tradition. So we know that meaning transcends identification. Like, one can feel meaning from a Jewish ritual regardless of whether one identifies as Jewish. And that's not new. That's ancient. There's all sorts of different eras in Jewish history where, like, you're in this room, you're loosely part of our project. Cool. That's what I envision. That's what I hope. I don't know if that's what the future will be. Like, that's what I would like the future to be, is one where we don't care so much if someone has become Jewish. We just care about conveying teachings or holidays or practices or whatever from the Jewish tradition to as many people as are out there that want to connect to them.
Well, I think I'm a little bit in between these extremes in the sense that I think that I'm going to go back to my analogy to being a progressive or being a Democrat, because it's not just that I am happy when people do a Democrat thing every once in a while, right? Like, I absolutely am, right? If somebody who is a Republican, for example, decides for whatever reason to vote for a progressive Democratic candidate in a particular election, I'm happy. A good thing from my perspective was done. But I am more happy when there's a large community of people who are standing for progressive values all the time, right? And now, I don't care what their identity is. I'm interested in what they're doing, and I'm interested in the critical mass effect of saying that if there's a critical mass of people that are committed to a particular approach, that hopefully means that they can have a bigger impact on the world around them. And ultimately, that's an important value to me, not just that people are having personal meaning, but that they're having a collective impact. And also that, I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but that I think that you hope that there's a community of people working on the project in a bigger way, because it'll make more progress there. Like, so for example, I'm a casual user of computers, and I certainly don't have an identity as a computer user, and certainly not as a computer creator, even though I actually, do a lot of my work creatively on a computer. But I don't have an identity of that nature in any way. I'm more a casual user, but it's really important to me that there's a community of people out there somewhere who consider themselves to be computer nerds or whatever, engineers, people that have devoted their life or a huge part of their life to working on this, because if there weren't, then I would have a more impoverished well from which to draw. Now, I think that a lot of Jews think of that as happening to a certain extent, where like the ultra-Orthodox represent to them what the computer nerds represent to me. What I would like to see is a different group of people, not the ultra-Orthodox, who are, secular, not religious Jews, nevertheless for whom Judaism was something that was really big for them, that was something that they were really taking on as more than a practice here or there, and that were kind of like the R&D team for what this was going to become. And not only that they're like doing that professionally, but I'm talking about people who are just, these communities that are really into it. Look, I mean, maybe a better example is like gaming communities, people who love games. And they're not necessarily the creators of the games. They're these people that are passionately participating in it. And because of their passion, things are created that are then available for people like me, who are the more casual game users. I think that I aspire more than you do that one day it'll be put back together. One day there'll be some new creation that will be like the Judaism that takes us into the future. Whereas I think that you're happier if it kind of stays falling apart and we can just kind of do different aspects of it.
Yeah, I'm definitely happy with that. And I don't know that you disagree with this, but I think it's been broken. It's been broken differently in interesting ways. Like, I don't think, and this gets to like Daniel Boyarin's argument. Like, I don't think I think the idea of a coherent Judaism that has really, in any measurable sense, in any era, actually been unified. I don't think that there's a Humpty Dumpty to put back together again. I think it's just a bunch of pieces of egg. But I want to roll with this because the Democrat thing's interesting, because what's fascinating is I don't identify as a Democrat. I certainly don't identify as a Republican. I don't think I've ever voted for a Republican, and I'm certainly not looking to in the near future. But like, I actively do not mark myself as a Democrat in my party identification. In Rhode Island, it's actually this hilarious thing where if you want to vote in a primary, you can walk in the room. You can declare yourself. You have to declare yourself in order to vote in the primary. You can declare yourself as a Democrat, and then as you walk out of the room, you can undeclare. It's like I think it's the only state that does it this way, and I think it's like a funny reflection of my own way of relating to it. Like, my politics are definitely a set of things I do, as opposed to a set of things I am. Like, and in all sorts of deep ways, like, I vote for almost all Democrats. Like, this works as an analogy because I'm as deeply, like, I'm like what you're describing in terms of the passionate group of people that is like out there deeply, like, I'm involved with groups of people who almost universally are voting for Democratic candidates and who largely might not identify as an identifier, as a thing that I am, as that they are Democrat. Like, they don't necessarily call themselves that. And I don't know, maybe there's generational things here, maybe there's not. Like, I don't know. But like, I'm thinking through all of, as you were giving really like beautifully your take here, I was thinking through the things I love the most, the things I do the most, and that I think of myself as like doing. And so Judaism is one. I think of myself as a Jew. That is a true statement. For all my talk about how I want to verb it and I'd like to do Jew, whatever, like, I do think of myself as a Jew. I don't envision that changing. I think it's possible that children, grandchildren could be deep participants in projects of Judaism without caring as much about calling themselves a Jew as I do. We'll see. Disc golf is probably my biggest hobby. It might sound trivial to people. I actually like play disc golf a lot, and I love it. And I have a bazillion. My current cover photo on Facebook is a bunch of disc golf discs. For those who aren't familiar, you might have heard of it as Frisbee golf, but it's a terrible name. They're not Frisbees. Longer conversation.
Like Judaism, like, terrible name.
Yeah, but I don't think, you mentioned how you'd never used Jewish identity, or as far as you can remember, never used Jewish identity in the past. I don't think I have ever said I am a disc golfer. I don't conceive of myself that way. I disc golf. When I meet somebody else who disc golfs, I'm like definitely feel a bond to them, and we like schmooze about it, whatever. But I'll say to them, yeah, I disc golf all the time. I go, like, I don't impart it to myself as a noun. And maybe some level of this is semantic. I don't know. Like, but ultimately, with the Democrat piece, whatever, like, I think actually a lot of the folks doing the most work that people in the Democratic Party care about, like whether it's on issues like Black Lives Matter or universal health care or whatever, like a lot of people doing work that is, even at this point, it wasn't always, even at this point, part of the Democratic Party platform, do not call themselves Democrats. And that's actually my point. Like, I think that I can totally envision a Jewish future, a Jewish world, whatever, or multiple Jewish futures where people are hardcore doing the Jewish. Like, they care about the calendar of holidays. They learn about the texts. They explore them. They create new ones. All that. Like, and look, it's not that they say, "Yo, I'm not a Jew." It's not that they're gonna like. But I just think that whole identification process and the importance that we would impart to it is, there's not a reason for me to think it's going to be that big a deal, because we're just living in a society where, like, you don't need to be anything to do that thing. The people contributing the most to Green Bay Packers culture are sports writers who probably don't root for the Packers, and as part of their job are not allowed to skew themselves too much. Like, they're the ones that are creating the most rich material for Packers fans to play with.
Well, and I think that the anxiety that probably some of our listeners have when you and I talk this way is questions like, okay, but if nobody wants to identify as a member, then how are institutions going to survive? And one possibility is that they won't survive, and that's fine. And by the way, of course, it's fine with me if a lot of particular institutions don't survive. The question is there a point at which your whole project can't really make it if it doesn't have any kind of home base or any kind of, main, or not necessarily one, but engines of creativity, and if everybody's sort of out taking little bits and pieces, then I think the anxiety is maybe it's going to ultimately just get too diffused and too fallen apart to actually continue anymore. And I think that's where a lot of the anxiety comes from. And I think that I would present that question in two ways. One is that I would say I share that anxiety, which is, I think, part of why I tend to be a little bit more focused than you are on, but hopefully the pieces will be put back together one day, right? The Judaism that we've inherited is broken, but I can imagine a way of fixing it, and then it'll be back to something whole again for a while until it falls apart again, which I'm sure that it will. But we need this period of stability. I share your point of view that it was never really as put together as we thought it was, or it was portrayed to be, but there's somewhere in between where it's put together enough that it can kind of clunk along as a system for a while, and with all the kind of positive things that come with that. That said, there's another possibility, which is that you're more right than I am in this conversation, and that what you're describing is actually a constituent dimension of the third era of Judaism, right? Because as we've talked about before, Judaism doesn't live on its own and never has, disconnected from the rest of what's going on in the society around it. And if we look at what's going on in our society, and I don't mean what's going on this year or over the last 10 years or even the next 40 years, who knows what kind of society we're heading into. But if you look at sort of the larger trends of where the world is going, it seems like we have all these technological revolutions happening and on the horizon. It seems that maybe elements like the nation state have run their course, when there's a particular state that's a particular nation, who knows? But things like those kinds of systems may be falling apart in a way that may be permanent, because once people can organize themselves on the internet, who knows what that does to geography and to countries and all of that stuff. So if we're heading into this kind of new period of the organization of society that we can only barely imagine, then you can look back in history and see, hey, that happened before. Nobody would have been able to imagine the society that we had in medieval Europe. Nobody would have been able to imagine that back in the biblical era. It's hard to even conceive of a Judaism in the future that looks all that much like the Judaism of the past. And at the point at which you recognize that, then I'm not totally sure whether the anxiety of how are institutions going to weather this storm is an anxiety that should be pursued. It really seems more like an anxiety that we should somehow try to get over, because there's no way that our institutions are going to be preserved through a disruption this great.
I'm flashing to Dan Judson's conversation he said very directly, look, synagogues should merge. I like in that tone, it was actually one of my favorite moments of the podcast. He would like, look, synagogues should merge. There's too many of them. And that's one of the most prominent kinds of Jewish institutions, synagogues. But like, yeah, I'm with you. Like, Jewish institutions are certainly not going to weather this storm. And when we recognize that that's not a failure, and that's not a symbol of, oh my gosh, our generation of Jews or of Judaism or whatever thing somehow failed. Like, no, it's not a failure. Like, look, we could go down the list of like individual Jewish institutions and play futurology and like have the fun guessing game of like, which one of the, like, will this one exist in 10 years? Will this one exist in 50 years? Will it exist in 100 years? And like, I spend my days sometimes guessing about that stuff because I'm a nerd. But like, the reality is, if they exist, they're going to be like so different that calling them the same institution may even be an overstatement. I mean, I think in the past of the show, you've talked about like how people say the GOP is the party of Lincoln or whatever. It's like, on paper, true. Like, does that mean a lot in terms of saying that like actually they're doing the same thing? Not so much. Like, okay, so if whether it's, this Jewish organization, that one, the JCC system, the ADL, some of them will exist for a little while, some of them exist for a longer while, some of them will not exist really soon. What they do is what I'm interested in. And I think the ones that exist are going to be doing differently. I liked our title for Tobin Belzer's episode, Studying Jews Differently. It's all differently. And continuing to break down that, like, that's actually the point. Like, that's actually the project, is the doing of Judaism differently. That's when we start to really move forward, because when we're stuck and trapped in this mindset of a coherent Judaism that really has been this transhistorical thread that is a quote religion that believes certain things, that contains certain holidays or rituals or practices that if you lost them, it would no longer be Judaism. Like, when we are held hostage by that, we maintain our institutions. Okay. What does that mean? Is that the success story that we're striving for? Or is the success story that we're striving for the one that the vast majority of eras of Judaism have gone with, maybe subconsciously, of radical discontinuity and construction of new institutions?
And maybe it brings our conversation today full circle to go back to Daniel Boyarin's book and what he was trying to say. I think that one of the reasons why we have so much confusion and so much struggle and so much guilt with a lot of these transitions is because we often have in some way taken a word in modern English and retrojected it through Jewish history all the way back to some ancient period where we feel that we are the directional ancestors of exactly those people and that concept, and that if we were to do something overly big in terms of stepping away from something that we have, we would have been doing some terrible injustice. And the problem with that is two things. One is that it fails to recognize how modern and how recent certain elements of Judaism are, that if we understood how modern they are, we would, I think, many of us would feel much more okay about leaving them behind and just saying, that didn't work, or that only worked for a limited period of time. It got us through a really challenging period when we needed it, but we don't need it anymore. So, and that's perfectly okay. The flip side of it is to say, if something is so ancient, it's been the same for 2,000 or 3,000 years, who am I to be the one to step away from it? And I think there's a lot of that going on. And even the word Jew, right? I mean, Boyarin talks about the word Judaism, but I think it's also really important to understand that the word Jew, the Hebrew of which is Yehudi, the word Yehudi in ancient times meant Judean. I think there's actually another book on keywords in Jewish studies about the word Jew. Maybe we should have that one on.
Because, Cynthia Baker. Yeah, we should.
Because I'm not totally sure when this happened, and we're talking about English, and I'm not sure which Greek or Latin word we're talking about in all cases. But at some point, the word that we understand today to be Jew moved from meaning Judean to somebody of this world population of Jews that did not necessarily come from Judah. But at the point at which that word changed meanings, something really significant happened such that a Jew didn't necessarily have to worry about maintaining all the elements of our ancient roots in Judea anymore. We're stuck in this world of saying we are Jews and we practice Judaism, and I think we have the worst of all worlds because we have because those words have modern meanings that we don't realize how modern they are, and we think that they have these extremely ancient meanings that they don't. And so psychologically, I think we're caught in this terrible trap which is preventing us from doing the creative work and the experimentation that we really need to do. And ironically, and isn't this always the case, our attempt to hold on to some notion of continuity is ultimately what threatens to bring the whole project crashing down, because we are trying to continue something that was never continuous. And in trying to hold on to making sure that we're not the last link in the chain, we will be the last link in the chain.
You are a mind reader. I was just going to go the link in the chain metaphor. I was thinking about this incredible, powerful moment in the movie Prince of Egypt. Paradigmatic millennial Jewish movie, and I, the staunch lover of millennial culture, am going to bring it up. There's this scene where the Pharaoh says, "I will not be the weak link in the chain," and that's it's actually said multiple times. We hear it from the Pharaoh who's the father of Ramses, who's in this movie. Sort of Moses' friend and whatever. We hear it from the father, then we hear it from Ramses later on. And it's positioned clearly in the context of how that desire to not be the weak link in the chain can have oppressive, terrible consequences. And look, don't read me as saying we are being pharaohs. We are equivalent to like the ancient model of slavery. Like, that's not what's happening here. But we've got to be able to analyze that mindset and what it looks like and how it manifests, not only in our positive associations of tradition and heritage and all of these terms that we use to describe what we receive from the past and what we want to pass on into the future. We have to be able to understand that a fidelity to that link in the chain mindset that transcends our desires for creativity, for justice, for whatever, could be a problem. And this is like a funny pivot or segue, but like I'm becoming more and more enthused about some conversations we're going to have, not just yet, but soon, about museums, because we're actually exploring the paradigmatic location of where the past lives and where we preserve it and where we conserve it and all of these words that Dan and I like to critique. But part of our premise is that actually museums aren't just that, and that they actually can be and should be seeds of creativity. And I think, and I bring that up once again, these episodes aren't immediate. They'll be in a little while, but I want to name that as a spoiler because we try to have the show be an ongoing conversation. And I think that this really is a defining theme of what we've been talking about thus far in our 2.5 years of the show, but also where we're looking to move forward to in 2019, because we really can't talk too much about how we need to reconceptualize memory and tradition and conservation and preservation, and on the flip side, but not flip side, creativity, invention, renewal, reconstruction, all of those terms. Like, we've got to be able to understand how those actually flow together and how the preservation of Judaism or of Jewish identity or of whatever we're calling it actually requires and necessitates the creativity. Okay, so deep breath. Dan and I going into these episodes don't always know exactly where we're going to go. And this is I feel like picture us up on the soapbox, or at least me up on the soapbox for this episode. Because I feel like we really tackled some big questions. We're going to close it out though. And as we do so, we want really to hear from you and to call out to all of you out there who are helping us in this project. This year, since it's the last of the year, we've really gotten so many sensational notes from all of you out there and had the opportunity on some occasions to be in touch via phone and video chat and all of these and in person and all of this. And it means a ton to us that we're able to do that. It is sometimes lonely as podcasters even though we know people are listening, we don't always know whether what we're saying resonates or how it resonates or what it leads to. So every time that somebody sends us a note or reaches out in one form or another really makes a difference. We're not just ending the episodes this way to be nice. So please be in touch with us, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can go to Twitter, and our feed is @Judaism Unbound. Third, you can go to our website, JudaismUnbound.com. And the last request we like to make, and which Dan mentioned at the top of the episode, is just genuinely, we really deeply appreciate whatever amount of financial donation you're able to make. Even a $2 monthly donation, if that's all you can do, is wonderful. And if you can do more, we of course appreciate that as well. So you can take on any variety of forms of donation, monthly, recurring, or one time at JudaismUnbound.com/donate. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.